right? Everybody is talking about race. Everybody is talking about sex. Everybody's talking about gender. Everybody's talking about sexuality. Everybody's talking about ability status and fat phobia and all of this shit every day now. You can't get away from it. It's in every article you read. It's in every conversation has to somehow acknowledge it.
Can you just go into some detail about what the kind of the central tenets of this social justice? It's hard. I'm not even sure what the exact right terminology to use is. I guess you call it a bunch of different things, but you could call it social justice.
I have settled on a term now. The term that I have settled on is a little bit more technical, but I think it's the right term, and I call it critical social justice. It's the idea of achieving social justice by using the various critical theories, including postmodern criticism, as well as formal, radical critical theory. That kind of vindicates Jordan Peterson to a degree, because it is the fusion of postmodernism as a kind of philosophical theory that doesn't believe in truth and thinks everything is just political power. And then neo-Marxism, which was it's the radical movement that basically started to see all of society as, in terms of oppression and in terms of how powerful interests are able to control how people think by making it cool or by putting it on TV or something like that. It's very kind of pop culture oriented, rather than where Marx thought it was all economics. They said, no, it's not economics. It's actually culture that influences people to get them to go against their own interests and not have the revolution that would liberate them. So that's what, some people call that cultural Marxism, but that's a tricky term. So that's the neo-Marxist side. That's the radical activism side. And then the postmodern theory is the knowledge is whatever you want it to be, more or less.
Yeah. So this is basically the kernel of the academic. This is basically the center of the academic thought, which has seeped into wider culture, which loads of people aren't aware has even happened, but still kind of just buy into some of the central tenets somehow by just the diffusion of these ideas into society. So in most journalists and most commentators on TV and loads of people you'll speak to are generally quite clued up and intelligent, will just take some of these assumptions of this theoretical outlook as just given, when actually if you look at the statistics on most of the issues they're talking about, those that make no sense at all. So the understanding you'd have of the nature of racism in society in the West at the moment, or in the UK or the US, or the nature of the gender pay gap, for example, or all these complicated things, you constantly just have a default position which loads of people subscribe to, which is basically society is unbelievably unfair, it's almost systemically corrupt, and there is just constantly new evidence coming out about this, and you'll see little clips on the internet which somehow reinforce these things. But actually, when you dig into these in detail, most of these points have serious issues with them, which need to be analyzed in much more detail than just summarized as, oh, society is really, really racist. Racism is holding these people back. Jobs are sexist and employers are sexist, and that's what's holding women back. It's way more complicated than that, but it just gets covered over basically by this academic literature. So I'm guessing that's what you address in your book, which you're about to publish, right?
Sure, yeah. So let me actually jump in real quick, because when I said a minute ago, before I talked about that last bit, that you said something that was very important, and I want to come back to that, because a lot of critics of the work that we're doing, especially academic critics, like to point out that it doesn't make any sense to blame the academic literature and to blame academia. Of course, they want to protect academia in general, especially, it's where they work. They're academics too. They are correct that they are getting good academics are getting unfairly tarred and feathered, not just because of our work, but because our work pointed to a problem that is something to do with academia. And they like to try to minimize that by saying, well, it's only a very small percentage. Even on campus, you don't really have a ton of this behavior, so on and so forth. It's a very small set of departments with a very small percentage of graduates. I think it's like 0.2% of graduates in the United States are in gender studies or something. It's very small. And they're like, obviously, academia can't be blamed for this being such a big deal in society. It must be something else. And you hit upon the correct point. The issues themselves are hot button issues, right? Everybody is talking about race. Everybody is talking about sex. Everybody is talking about gender. Everybody's talking about sexuality. Everybody's talking about ability status and fat phobia and all of this shit every day now. You can't get away from it. It's in every article you read. It's every conversation has to somehow acknowledge it. It comes up over and over and over again. Whatever the set of reasons are for that, and they're probably complicated in many, including graduating enough graduates that have gone on to write about it in all those articles and so on.
Yeah.
The fact is, everybody's talking about it. And so when they turn to the academic literature to say, well, what do we know about race? What do race scholars say about race? This is the stuff they're looking at. They're not finding rigorous material because rigorous material is barely allowed to be published.
Yeah.
Anything that goes against the party line actually gets shouted out of the literature, or it gets argued by this new stuff that it was debunked. But as you said, it doesn't really have any great credentials. So when you have something happening in society that's made race, sex, gender, sexuality, issues of identity extremely interesting to people. Lots of people are talking about it all the time. And when they turn to that gold standard literature, what are they going to see? It turns out to be a heaping pile of shit, but they think that they're seeing, and this is what they call themselves, race scholars. We consulted race scholars, and now we have to have this diversity program. We consulted gender scholars, and now, you know, medicine has to be reorganized to deal with this, that, and the other thing. But the thing is that the research, everybody thinks it's real, but it's what we're trying to show with our papers is that there's something wrong there, that it can't really be relied on. But the reason that this literature is such a small percentage of what's happening and yet has such a huge outsized influence on our society is because everybody's interested in it. So everybody's looking to turn and say, well, what's the best information out there about it? And then you read all this crazy shit. And so that's what appears to be the best information there is about race, sex, gender, sexuality, and ability status, and fat status, and every other kind of status that you can imagine is your identity. So I know that I'm like kind of oddly fixated on this, but for like 2 years, we've been struggling to try to find a way to communicate how something so small amount of funding, relatively speaking, small number of people, relatively speaking, in the academy can have such an outsized influence. And it's because they got just enough of their stuff out there, whether through activists, whether through people who have gone into like journalism as activists, through teaching, whatever it happens to be, they got just enough of their stuff out there to where it became the cultural conversation. So now everybody's turning to look at it. So that's why it ended up having such an outsized influence.
But part of what's so weird about it is, so on any given issue, so, okay, classic example is I started off in academia as someone who's absolutely committed to fighting racism, sexism, and so on. And my commitment to that hasn't changed at all, but I came out the other end of, or studying at university, studying this stuff, just being basically convinced that despite the fact that I'm just as committed to fighting sexism and racism as I ever was, the fact that I don't agree with what these people are saying has got no relation to my dislike of racism and sexism, but criticizing anything they say is now treated as basically the same as being an actual racist and sexist. So I oppose as much of those people. And such an annoying phenomenon is.
That's why we did this.
Yeah, that's why I was so desperate to get you on the show, because you're literally like one of the only voice I've ever heard who summarizes the point I've been making nonstop for basically a decade now, but you just summarize it way better than I do. But for example, there'll be a news story and it will just have this standard, unbelievably misleading statistics on, for example, something like the Black Lives Matter movement. So me opposing the basically intentional or unknowing distribution of deliberately, essentially misleading statistics on things like the treatment of ethnic minority communities by the police and how likely something is to happen and the reasons for it, and saying the narrative being pasted by the Black Lives Matter movement is way too simplistic, but it's being adopted by everyone. And I'll try and bring that up and say, look, I think there are problems with this. Someone who doesn't know much about it will go on their phone, Google it, and be like, no, look, there's this article here. This article says the opposite of that. You're talking rubbish. And the reason there's like 50 articles on every one of these issues is these issues are exactly what these basically fraudulent academics want everyone to focus on. And when they do focus on it, so much of the focus is dictated by this strand of academia. So it's such a weird repeating cycle. And also we're in a situation where one of the things I'm most happy about basically is that in the West, obviously there is still racism and sexism, and that needs to be addressed. But in many ways, it's less bad in the West than it's ever been in most societies ever. But the focus on it has basically increased, in line with it going down. So they've painted this completely false picture of what's going on.
Not just in, racism and sexism are kind of a big thing everywhere. And it's actually that they are quite realistically the least in countries like the UK, the US, and so on. It's not to say that there's none. It's just to say that there's the least. I mean, I think it's important to understand, for example, if more Black people are dying from the COVID-19, that we understand why, and we try to figure out steps to take to make sure that anything that's discriminatory or unfair or unjust gets taken care of. But to say that it's all just discrimination is a completely different thing. And that mindset that wants to bulldoze all of the necessary data in order to just push a narrative that is this one variable, that's where you're talking about that the analysis that they're giving is way too simplistic.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's not even based in reality. It's based in interpretive reality. It's based on what they call lived experience, which is by definition, two things: highly interpretive, meaning it's not what they actually experienced, it's how they felt about what they experienced. And secondly, that it has to be in accordance with theory. If, say, I mentioned a Black person who says, well, slavery was a long time ago, they'll say, well, you're just speaking into white power discourses. You're acting white. You're white adjacent.
But that's such a good example. So another thing is, so I think that there's some validity to some of the points which these people make. So on an So like on an interpersonal level, for example, something I get annoyed by is I really find so much of the theory behind it really annoying, but I don't like completely throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I don't like the idea of, for example, a comedian making an off-color joke, and then the kind of people who are fed up with the SJW type professors will often be like, see, this is fine. This is the type of humor we want. I'll be like, no, I understand the need to be sensitive to this sort of thing on an individual interaction basis. Mm-hmm. But then I'll take that stuff really, really seriously. And I understand it. I'm like, yeah, maybe there is like a microaggression going on. So you don't want to say that. And then someone will come out who's, let's say, Black or Jewish or whatever. Like, I'm Jewish or whatever ethnicity someone is. They'll come out and say something which goes against the narrative of the SJW types who are telling everyone to be really sensitive to microaggressions. And then the SJW types will actually use like old-fashioned racist language, which I wouldn't even use on here, and overtly racially abuse essentially the person who's come out and say, you don't even count as a Black person. You don't count as gay anymore because you don't support the right party. You don't count as this group or that group because you don't agree with us, but it actually is kind of racist. Correct. And so it's like, why am I paying so much attention to these things you're saying are really important if you suddenly just completely disregard them when you do something? It's yet another example of that sort of hypocrisy. It's actually just amazing how it goes unnoticed.
Right.